Hello history buffs and welcome back to the channel. I'm Hannah, and with the release of season 2 of Wolf Hall, I'm going to be going back through season 1 and then season 2 and telling you all of the Easter eggs and references found in each episode. Please note that this is not a review, nor is it a what was accurate video, as this is adapted from historical fiction. As always, let's start with the episode title. This episode is called Crows. There are multiple meanings to this. It may symbolise bad luck, as crows are often associated with ill omens. You then have the phrase, a gathering of crows, which could represent the Boleyn family's tight-knit but combative nature in late 1535 and early 1536. Put the two together and you have the downfall of the Boleyn faction, which starts in this episode and ultimately culminates in the next. The visual theme of shadows is prominent throughout the episode, with characters emerging from and receding into darkness, creating a tense atmosphere. The episode opens with King Henry dining at Wolf Hall, the home of the Seymours, as Cromwell is now trying to make alliances with the Seymours over the Boleyns, and Jane by now has caught the king's eye. Jane's father, Sir Thomas Seymour, is played by Paul Ritter, a great British actor who unfortunately died in 2021 and was best known as Martin Goodman in Friday Night Dinner.
Where was the mouse?
Over there. Bugger.
Jane's father was also mentioned earlier in the series by Anne Boleyn when she's talking to Cromwell in the gardens about the sinners at Wolf Hall. At the table, Sir John says to Cromwell, "Perhaps you'll find a bride while you're here." Throughout the series, Cromwell has shown a romantic liking to Jane, and as her father says this, Thomas Cromwell glances down at Jane. Jane is sat next to Gregory Cromwell, and the two seem to be getting on well. Now, this is relevant, but not for what you might think. Gregory would go on to marry Jane's sister, Elizabeth, in 1537. This marriage seemed to be arranged, however, after Jane was queen. But it could be this interaction here that the fictitious Cromwell first comes up with the idea of potentially marrying his son into the Seymour family after his own attempt fails, which will fail pretty much immediately. As in the next scene, Cromwell watches from a window. Henry courts Jane. Upon seeing this, Cromwell, quite literally, steps back into the shadows. It's worth noting that his son Gregory is also asleep in this room, so maybe that's when this fictitious version of Cromwell parks the Jane idea for now, but is what lays the groundwork for Gregory and Elizabeth's arranged marriage. The cinematography for this episode is amazing. In the next scene, Thomas Cromwell is sat at the table with Jane, Edward, John, and Thomas Seymour, and they are advising Jane on how she should act with the king to promote her own social standing. They're essentially grooming and coaching her to rise as Anne Boleyn's replacement. This is one of the many parallels between Anne and Jane, as Anne's faction would have done the same. It also feeds into the narrative that Jane wasn't without ambition. The episode showcases the practice of nobility pushing female relatives into the king's sight for potential favour. Cromwell and Rafe Sadler go to visit Catherine of Aragon, who is and really was in exile at Kimbolton Castle. In fact, she would die here. As Cromwell walks down the corridor, he passes one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, who is wearing the traditional gable hood that is most associated with Catherine of Aragon and her supporters, unlike Anne Boleyn and her court, who favoured the rounded French hood. Although it's important to note that Anne did also wear gable hoods, it's just what we stereotypically associate with. Catherine says to Cromwell, "When my first son was born, it was winter." The son she's referring to is Henry, Duke of Cornwall, who was born on the 1st of January 1511, which indeed is one of the 3 winter months that are December, January and February. I feel like we needed to recap this, as some people put their Christmas trees up in November. Why are you putting a Christmas tree up in the last month of autumn? Why? Catherine, knowing that her time is short, then requests to see her daughter Mary, as in the show, just like in history, mother and daughter were kept apart. and unfortunately, Catherine's request would never be granted. Although, interestingly, Catherine refers to her daughter as the Princess Mary, whereas Cromwell responds with the Lady Mary. This highlights Catherine's refusal or denial to acknowledge the annulment of her marriage to Henry, her daughter's illegitimacy, and the legality of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Catherine of Aragon's meeting with Cromwell also reveals her continued insistence on being addressed as Queen. Cromwell then says that Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, has written to Mary, saying he could get her out of the country. And Holy Roman Emperor Charles V did offer to give Mary support to get out of the country. But Catherine doesn't want Mary to jeopardise her place in the line of succession. Catherine then asks after Anne Boleyn, saying that she heard that she miscarried, saying, "I know how that is." As we know, Catherine had 6 pregnancies, and tragically only 2 came to term. Henry, Duke of Cornwall, who died a month later, and Mary. The other 4 were either miscarriages or stillbirths. Catherine in this moment is showing compassion for Anne, a kindness that was never reciprocated. Catherine, although dying, is still well enough to pick up from Cromwell's response that he might have lost the ear of the Queen, who until recently had shared common or aligning goals. "I thought she always confided in you. I do hope there is no rift." This highlights the fragility of power and Cromwell's increasingly vulnerable position, a running theme throughout this episode. Hi everyone, I'm so excited to finally share something that I've been working on for months. My book, King Henry VIII and His 6 Wives. I have poured so much love into this project, working closely with my amazing illustrator to make it as vibrant and engaging as possible. Whether you're a kid or a history buff just like me, or just someone who loves a good story, I think you'll love this book. It's been such a joy to create, and I can't wait for you to read it yourself. You can grab your copy now on Amazon, just click the link below, and if you do, let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to know what you think. Thanks for all your support, and happy reading! We see a cute little dog dead. The dog had fallen out of the window, and Anne is clearly upset. Her dog Percoy really did die from a fall in December 1534, so therefore most likely from a window. And we know that Anne was so upset that no one dared to tell her, so the king had to break the news to her. We know this because Thomas Broke wrote to Lady Lisle, the original owner of Percoy, where he wrote, "Her Grace delighted so much in little Percoy, that after he was dead of a fall, there durst nobody tell her Grace of it, till it pleased the King's Highness to tell her Grace of it." Percoy, an innocent, as Anne puts it, is another example of vulnerability. Anne Boleyn says, "Oh, get away, Mary." She is referring to her fool, who is a dwarf. She tells Cromwell that she renamed her Mary because, as she says, the king's daughter is almost a dwarf, isn't she? Anne Boleyn's remark about renaming her dwarf fool Mary is a cruel jab at Princess Mary's stature, but it appears to be an exaggeration and likely motivated by personal animosity rather than an accurate reflection of Mary's physical appearance. The historical records provide a more nuanced picture of Mary's height. As a child, Mary was described inconsistently. In 1522, at the age of 7, she was called very tall for her age by one ambassador, while another report from the same year described her as still so small. In 1527, at the age of 11, French ambassadors noted she was slight and small for her age. As an adult, Mary was consistently described as short or of low stature. In 1541, she was described as being of middle stature. In 1554, she was called of low stature. And in 1557, she was described as low rather than of a middling stature. While Mary was indeed short, calling her almost a dwarf is a significant exaggeration. Her height was likely below average, but not extremely so. The average height of women in the 16th century was around 5 foot to 5'2", and Mary was probably just below this range. Anne Boleyn's comment reflects the political and personal tensions between her and Mary, rather than an accurate description. As Mary's stepmother and a key figure in her father's break with the Catholic Church, Anne had a contentious relationship with the princess. The remark about Mary's height was likely intended to belittle and mock her stepdaughter, emphasising Anne's own position and attempting to diminish Mary's status and appeal. This incident highlights how physical attributes could be weaponised in court politics, with Anne using an exaggerated description of Mary's stature as a means of verbal attack and social positioning. Anne then says how the French will have a shock when they see her. I know they're trying for a match between her and the Dauphin, which isn't completely untrue. The Dauphin of France was considered as a suitor for Mary, however this had been called off by 1535, which is when this episode is set. Anne then goes on to say how she feels alone and almost betrayed by the French, which is understandable. Anne had spent much of her childhood in France and would have seen France as a second home, especially seeing as Catherine was Spanish and had the support of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Cromwell then says there was a time when you would have listened to my advice, highlighting the decline of their friendship and how it isn't what it once was. He then also offers pretty sound advice that I'm sure many Anne stans would agree with, of keeping your head down until you can produce the king a boy, and to ignore Jane, who is nothing more than a distraction. It's hard to say for certain how long their relationship would have lasted due to how short their marriage was. Cromwell and Chapuis then have a discussion about the dissolution of the monasteries and how Chapuis wants it to stop. He basically tells Cromwell to make Henry stop with the dissolution and the Reformation, otherwise he will influence Charles V to cease selling crops to England. In a fictional scene, Chapuis warns of impending famine, claiming England is purchasing grain from the Emperor's territories and that this trade could be halted. When Cromwell inquires about the Emperor's motives, Chapuis suggests it would demonstrate England's poor governance. This scenario is historically inaccurate for several reasons. In the 16th century, England was not dependent on food imports from the Holy Roman Empire's territories. Trade between England and the Netherlands primarily involved wool, not food staples. The concept of using food as a political weapon to demonstrate poor governance is more characteristic of modern times. And the term corn in this context likely refers to wheat, as maize was not yet consumed in England during Henry VIII's reign. England's food supply in the Tudor era was largely domestic. Markets and fairs throughout the country provided access to various foods. London, for instance, had a network of 16 markets to supply its residents. The variety of food available, especially at court, was extensive and included both local and imported items. While there was trade with continental Europe, it primarily involved luxury goods rather than staple foods. Imported items included citrus fruits, almonds, and olive oil from the Mediterranean, as well as spices from Asia. Chapuis then tells Cromwell that he knows that Catherine is dying and doesn't have much longer to live, and that he wants to see her, as he doesn't want her to die alone. Chapuis did actually go visit Catherine in her dying days. He was with her from the 2nd till the 6th of January, and left believing that her health had improved. Catherine then dies the day after. And that's where I'm going to end today's video. Episode 5 has so many Easter eggs and historical references that this will be a 3-parter. And then we will have one more episode in Season 1 before we move on to Season 2. I love breaking down this series. However, it takes a lot of time and energy preparing this series, and I am finding it a struggle right now. So once Season 1 is finished, I will be taking a break before tackling Season 2. I hope you guys all understand. However, in the meantime, if there are other movies or TV shows you would like me to do once I've finished Wolf Hall, then please do let me know. As always, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you really enjoyed this content that I make, then why not leave a super thanks. But until the next one, have a wonderful day.